My name is John Starr. I currently run PDK International, which is a 112-year-old membership association. I won't go into all the details, but follow me on Twitter. You're all on your devices anyway, so just follow me on Twitter, and you'll see everything about it. I'm a former superintendent in 2 different districts. I'm a former accountability guy, former teacher, former lots of things, and now I'm in the nonprofit space. And when we talked about getting this conversation together, it was really about this idea that drove me in many ways as a superintendent and as an accountability guy. My mantra was always, at best, the data help you ask better questions. Right? We have tons of data out there. There's all this stuff that exists in all these different databases within school systems. And everyone talks about database decision making. There's all these things that we would love to be able to do, but may not be able to do. How do people actually make sense of it? What's promising? What's not? What are the pitfalls? How should we interact in ways that actually help systems improve the actions of adults, which helps improve outcomes for kids and families. So that's what this awesome panel is going to talk about. I've got some softball questions for them, I've got some hard questions for them, and we're going to have a good conversation. So I'm going to have everybody introduce themselves briefly, and we'll start with John Supplements over there.
Hi everybody, my name is John Sapovitz. I am a professor of leadership and policy at the University of Pennsylvania, and I direct something called the Consortium for Policy Research in Education. And I've been both studying and teaching about data use for a long time. Thank you.
Good afternoon everybody. My name is Satya Nitter. I currently lead the education technology effort at IBM Research using the Watson computer system. And I've been at IBM for 18 years. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Maya Sharpley, and if you look at the through line of my career, I built businesses for companies. So whether that was strategy and operations, Joel Klein, New York City Department of Education, Executive Director of Operations, at Kaplan for about 10 years, building businesses around the world, Charter Schools USA back into K-12, and now working for various ed tech companies doing the same thing. So excited for this thing, Josh.
Good afternoon, Phil Dunn, Chief Information Officer from Greenwich Public Schools. Former teacher, lawyer by trade, done many things, former developer. I currently lead the technology, data, and research effort for a school district of about 10,000 students, and we've proudly had a one device deployed for every student and staff member, going into our 5th year running now. So we have a lot of data and lots to talk about.
Hi everyone, my name is Chris Rush. I am a co-founder and chief program officer at a national nonprofit called Classrooms, formerly School of One. We deliver personalized learning models to public, private, and charter schools all over the country. So figuring out schedule every teacher every day based on how you did the day.
All right, first let me just quick sound check. Can everybody hear that when we were talking? Because I know it's good, thumbs up? All right, cool, thank you, because I know the back was hard. All right, so I want to start actually from a parent perspective, because I have my daughter's almost 16, she's a sophomore, my son is 14, he's a freshman, and I got a 4th grader as well. And maybe, Satya, I'm going to start with you, because you're working at IBM. When I think about the data that we're inundated with all the time, and everybody knows everything about it all the time. But what's the world we're preparing our kids for as it relates to just this incredibly data-rich environment? What should we be thinking, what should educators be thinking about data and the world of 2026, 2030, 2035? Let's start with you.
Boy, that's not an easy one.
25 words or less. That's why you got to remember it.
I personally, this might be a bit of a harsh indictment on education systems today, but I don't really think we're doing a great job of preparing our children for the world they're entering, right? There's this massive gap between what they experience outside school with devices, with technology, with experiences, with things like virtual reality, and what we do to them within the confines of a classroom. So I don't really think we're doing a great job of preparing them for the world they're entering to start with, just from kind of an experience perspective. The second thing is we're also in a time of very non-linear change. Technology is very dramatically changing the world, it's changing the future of work, it's changing jobs, it's changing the kinds of skills that people need to have. And it's not just K-12. In general, our education system is not producing people who are actually skilled enough to participate in the workforce at large. And I'm not talking about the elite that exists here. I'm talking about the rest of the 80% of the world that doesn't actually have access to the kinds of learning environments and skills that will prepare them for fruitful careers. And I think that's actually a huge issue. I think that's something that needs to be addressed. So, I mean, the last thing I want to say is it's very hard to prepare for a world where half the jobs that exist are unknown at this point in time. Things like chief AI officers didn't even exist 3 years ago, right? So the thing that we ought to do is to prepare our children to develop the metacognitive skills that will allow them to learn how to learn, and use technology to create much more immersive, much more interactive, personalized experiences that allow them to feel the sense of engagement they feel outside of the classroom. So that's basically my perspective.
So Phil and Chris, you guys are both sort of working on that in different domains. You're in both School 1, or I forget what you guys go, Teach Someone, sorry. And Phil, your work as a CIO. So talk a little bit about that disconnect that was just described, right, between like this kind of world we're preparing kids for, and how data rich it is, and the kinds of skills they need to be able to understand that, and what we're doing today in classrooms.
Yeah. I like to say in my office that you see a paradigm shift where we're managing kind of the content chasing the standards when we build K-12 curriculum. We're basically saying, okay, here's some enumerated list of standards, and we're going to create some content that we think delivers that. And we're not really thinking about it the other way around, where it's the standards tagging to the content. So we go, what are the things we want people in a higher order society to do? And now, how do we understand how those things map back to their students? So I think that's the big shift, and I'm fortunate in Greenwich that we actually do push in that direction of really rethinking our curriculum, rethinking what we want in terms of outcomes, but we're nowhere near there yet. We're probably at the front of the public school districts in the area.
Chris, what about you guys? How are you approaching this?
Yeah, I think in respect to a parent, as you frame this, there are two disconnects that are sort of floating around out there. One is, if you look at the traditional model of learning, most of that was about how do we get a certain set of information into kids' heads. And there are standards set up to do that each year. So the first disconnect that happens there is that we have textbooks, we have common core curriculum, depending on what state you're coming from, you may have some offshoot of that, that's trying to march kids through a certain set of things in second grade, third grade, fourth grade, and so on. And it's not set up very well if you ever get off course. You have to somehow catch up 3 years, 4 years, 5 years worth, but the classroom is still trying to teach everything like you were on track. So it's not adjusting and personalizing to you. So one area to really be able to use data, one area that we really need to improve what we're doing for students, is to understand which things they already know and which things they don't. So you're not wasting your time teaching them something they're not ready for. And you actually have a shot at catching them. So I think that's first. I think the second disconnect really comes in not just putting knowledge into kids' heads, but as you were just saying, we don't know what the jobs of 2026 are going to be, or 2036, or 2046. So it's going to be important to not only put certain knowledge in kids' heads, but to also teach them the skills of learning how to learn. And sometimes that can be from a teacher, sometimes it needs to be from each other, sometimes it needs to be on the ground doing a project, engaging, and sometimes it needs to be learning independently. Students need to be able to look at data, they need to be able to talk to other people, they need to be able to capture that information, they need to be able to synthesize. And I think that's one of the things that's missing from the traditional model that we're trying to bridge today.
So let me ask, I'm going to go Maya and John, I want to ask you guys to answer the same question. Do we have too much data or not enough? And both in, when I think of school systems, I think broad, right? Is the operational side, which I know Maya is your area of expertise, but there's also the student achievement side as well as other aspects. So when you think about school system operations, right? Large district, small district, do we have too much data or not enough data? And you guys can find out some of this.
It depends.
Speak as a man.
It depends, of course. I think that we have too much and not enough data, which probably argues that we don't have the right type of data. So the data that we're collecting is for the system of yesterday. The data that we need is to help the system of tomorrow. And I think one of the things that's also missing in this conversation is that as we focus on the student and as we think about AI and how it enables student learning, we have to remember that teachers are in between that oftentimes. And so how do we make sure that they're in between it in a way that's helpful and not kind of a door or something where they don't understand and forget to train them and then it's pushed to the side. So I think as we think about the data that we need, it's not only data on how is little Maya doing in school and is she falling behind or is she ahead of the standards or whatever it is we're tracking, but it's also how do I use that data and make it actionable to a teacher so that she can understand if I have 30 kids in a classroom or 25, how I can adjust and actually help little Maya while at the same time helping Chris. So I think it's a combination of too much and not enough, but also not always the right type. We're not capturing it.
And I'm hearing this theme of
Kids, which is very different than data for teachers and very different than data for administrators. And so I think that when we speak generically about data, we really run the risk of blurring the lines about different kinds of data for different kinds of purposes. And when we try to combine, put multiple uses around the same set of data, then we get degradation on ends of the spectrum. So I think it's really important to start thinking about who is the data for and how does it help them in particular do their job, as opposed to the notion that one size fits all data, that we can use the same data for accountability purposes that we can use, for example, for instructional improvement purposes.
So in some schools, I've seen, and you know, some people think that it's a wonderful approach, that you have data walls, right, and kids know where they are relative to the standard. Anybody seen this out there? Right, and the idea is that you should be able to track really easily where I am relative to the standard, and that will then motivate or influence or get you to change your behavior because I see, oh, I'm yellow or I'm red and I want to be green on whatever day. Have you guys seen any of that, right? I mean, so when you talk about data for whom, is that something, is that a good example of using data to drive improvement? And anybody can answer.
You guys don't jump in.
I live in this stuff, right? So I think one of the biggest problems is we don't render our assumptions explicit that we have about the system. So implicit in what you just said is, you walk into a traditional classroom, they have these linear walls. We assume learning is this kind of linear construct, right? Like I did this on Monday, and now I'm this far on Tuesday, and now I'm that far on Wednesday. There's no or role for reflection that we write down. There's no circularity in terms of how we learn or any kind of, non-linear, parametric, however you want to describe it in the math term, relationship with learning. Then secondly, going back to the earlier point, we tend to look at in school districts, because I work in one, mostly academic data, right? So we make this assumption that most of the things that create academic outcomes are endogenous to the realm of academic data. And we don't even have a clear causal nexus on how we get from point A to point B. That we like. No one's written the book on. If someone starts here, then we're going to get them to here by doing this. It's more like stochastic, fuzzy, like a raindrop going down your wall. So I think that's probably the next layer of the work in school districts, is to really revisit our assumptions, make them explicit, and then understand the limitations of our current model.
You mean our assumptions about how kids learn?
Our assumptions about how kids learn, our assumptions about what actually cause outcomes, both in the short run and longitudinally. So I haven't seen a tremendous number of reliable, credible studies on what people currently in the greatest generation, what schools they went to, how they performed, etc., and have that be institutionalized in school districts throughout the nation. So there's a whole kind of world of work to be done with regard to data that is great for talking about.
Chris?
Yeah, I would add to that. So one of the nice things about my job is I get to work in a variety of different schools all over the country, some of them over in 2 years. And I think we tend to look for answers in education that, we tend to look for answers in education that are like, this is the best practice. We should do this, then this, then this. We should put a data wall up. And I think the answer to the question is it completely depends, but not it depends on the population. Data is part of a culture that you're going to set up in a school. And depending on where the motivations are, what the starting points are, it's really going to change for students. We had this idea a number of years ago in our program, and we had created something called the game, right? It was when games were all the rage, and everyone should be playing a game to learn, and that'll be more effective. And we did it in our first school, and it was sort of this Super Mario Brothers-like world, and you could move from one place to the other, and all your points were up there, and everyone loved it. And then we went to another school, and they sort of liked it. We went to another one, and they loved it, and the next school hated it. They thought it was like the most kitschy, ridiculous thing ever. And I think the big lesson there is that you should figure out how to use that information in a way to motivate your set of students. But whether or not that's data on the wall, whether that's going to be embarrassing or not to them, whether they're going to find it lame, it totally depends on the population. And you just have to really adjust and use these as tools, but not think that one tool always works for every set of students.
I just want to add one other thing, that inherent in this question is the notion that data are a motivational thing, and there's no doubt that they are. But there's another key aspect, which is what's the information that sits inside of the data that allows somebody to get some perspective and purchase to make some kind of response. And so in this notion of I'm yellow and I want to get to green, it doesn't really tell me anything about how I should get there. It might motivate me to get there, but it doesn't tell me anything how to get there. And I think that distinction is a really important distinction, because a lot of data, really the purpose is to give a instructor, whether it's a teacher or administrator or even a student who's doing peer teaching, some kind of leverage to know what to do next. And without that, I think data are kind of always going to be sort of at a semi-useful level.
So, Satya, I'm curious as to how you guys working on AI, right? And working in IBM, you're generating tons of data, right? How are you using it for decision-making purposes? And the reason I ask that is because one of the great challenges that we have in school systems and schools is to go from data to knowledge, right, into decision. There's a so what aspect. Like, now I know, so what do I do about it? But I imagine you guys are probably pretty good at that. So I'd be curious as to what you do that might might be applicable into the school system.
Right. I mean, so to start with, we actually consume data. We generate some data, but primarily we consume data. Data being, data about students' performances, or data that they generate from essays they write or answers they write, and so on and so forth. There are two major ways we use the data, and two major applications of AI in kind of a K-12 school system, right? The first is that we actually use the data to help teachers figure out how their class is doing, relative to whereas the rest of the classes or grades in the school system or in the country are. And so this data can be very fine-grained. It can be tuned to the level of each student's strengths and weaknesses, and so on. But it's meant to give a teacher a really quick snapshot about how they're performing and how is their class performing. And along with that, where the AI kicks in, there's a whole bunch of recommendations to the teacher about what to do for every single student, right? Then we have a set of technologies that are potentially a lot more exciting, which are in the area of intelligent tutoring. Where the computing system essentially tutors the children directly and autonomously. And that's meant to be a supplement to what they experience within a formal learning setting. So you can basically sit in a classroom, but you could also potentially interact with an intelligent tutor, either as a part of your class or outside class. And these are meant to be essentially systems that engage in very natural ways with the students, engage them through language, dialogue, and get to know each of the students and personalize their recommendations and their responses and their feedbacks for every single student. So these are the two major applications of AI. in K-12 at the moment. There are other applications. There's certainly, an extension of intelligent tutoring is around test prep. A further extension of that is around, helping students figure out which careers and which colleges and so on to choose. All these things are basically virtual agents or virtual assistants that are student-facing, right? So these are the two major kind of ways we look at the world of education from a technology perspective.
But you have a lot of experience on the operational side, right? And one thing we don't talk about enough is what kinds of data we should be using, how we should be using it, and what's most useful to folks who actually have to make decisions about HR and transportation and all those things, which is like boring stuff, but it's the that's the bones of the system. So to talk a little bit about the best use of data for operational decision purposes, so that it's not just, well, this is the way we've done it since 1973, so we're going to keep doing this. What's your experience with that?
You don't think it's good if we just keep doing it the way we've done it?
Well, if it worked in 1973, then I'm all right with it, but...
So I think the key thing is, it's about, when you think about a budget or a school budget, it's the resources are primarily tied up with people, and then all of the other things, lunches, buses, etc. Facilities is a huge number. And so as you're thinking about how you deploy resources against those people in the building, whether it's students or teachers, how are you making the best use of that dollar, and how are you actually able to solve the right problems, right? So oftentimes we just look at data because it's what we've always tracked, but we're not actually digging into it to say, if I were to teach this differently, if I were to change the curriculum, if I were to train my teachers differently, then while I would have an outlay here, I would actually move the needle on student achievement, or I would be able to reduce my churn because teachers wouldn't be frustrated and they would leave, or they would stay because there's a clear path. So all of those types of decisions, which actually add a lot of churn to the school, which changes the culture, and also a lot of dollars as you're thinking about it. I think so. It's the student data, but it's how does that influence all of the other decisions you make, right? And that's the piece that we're often missing because they're captured in different systems, because different people are capturing them and they have different rules for capturing that data. So as we think more holistically and we think about some of the things that we could get out of an IBM Watson, which I've seen in the classrooms, as we think about how that actually influences what happens when that door closes in the classroom, and then how we support that environment and where we can shift resources to support that, I think those are the types of questions and those are the types of problems we need to think about more holistically. It was a lot easier.
And what does the ed tech world get wrong about the way data actually is used in school systems? And whoever wants to answer it. And this one we call. All right, John, you start.
So we were wrong. I got the tough questions. Not you. So I'm a big fan of technological developments in education, and I think some of the things that we've gotten right are how we have gotten so much more sophisticated and so much more efficient and made data so much more accessible to decision makers. The challenge, and I believe the next frontier, is not to refine the presentation and structures of existing data, but to reimagine what are the data that we could generate that would be useful to teachers, to school leaders. So I think that we've squeezed more efficiency out of the current data systems, and the next thing is to re-envision what different kinds of data might we need to actually help these people do their jobs better.
Yeah, from my direct experience, I'd say in this order, the cloud, people take that for granted, but I have over 200 different software resources deployed in my school district. So in the old days, when I used to have to worry about touching machines, imaging things, having caching servers, that was a nightmare for me to even deploy one thing. So I'd say the cloud, then mobile, which has been a game changer.
So that's something that folks have gotten right.
That they've gotten right. I mean, we take it for granted. People really don't stop and think about like software as a service, how game changing that's been from an IT standpoint. Mobile, which when you look at student usage of resources, there's something, I hate to use this word, but there's almost something magical about watching students, and we're a district where all our elementary kids have iPads, pre-K through, and there's some transcendental, intimate connection that they create, seriously, with the software. When you come to classrooms, when you go to common spaces or media centers, and it's that magical thing between the content and that tactile nature, and that student at that right age of development feeling like this is mine, I don't have to ask someone for this, I can go over here and do what I want to do. I've seen that be phenomenal, especially for the vendors that really own the functionality of mobile. But I would say on the critical end of things is vendors aren't attentive enough to what it really takes to deploy any given piece of software. School districts are very chaotic, entropic environments, largely by design, I would say. And again, going back to that 200 pieces of software I have to support, platforms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, it's very difficult when someone says, well, can I be the 201st? And it's $100,000 for this platform, and you'll figure it out. No one figures it out. The teachers don't figure it out. Maybe the one teacher who went to the conference, who got the training at the conference, will figure it out. But I'd say that's what they need to think more about, that implementation piece.
Chris, what do you think? What do they get right and where do they get wrong?
Yeah, I think we like to say when we are working with students in schools that it's all about the students. And I think the students, most of the time, are meant to come first and foremost. And a lot of the ed tech products out there are looking at student data and looking at patterns and trying to make recommendations so that teachers and administrators can make decisions. But I think realistically, the students exist in a larger ecosystem within the school. Some of all the operating things that Maya was just talking about, or staffing decisions that need to be made. How often I end up in school and the reason they don't make some changes because they don't want to upset one teacher and have them move their classroom or change the schedule or take away the first lunch period versus the last lunch period. These are factors, and we have to look at these students and these teachers in that larger context in order to inform decisions. And while I think there are great recommendations being made for what should happen with the students, I think missing that other context is something that the ed tech space really needs to figure out.
Other thoughts on it?
So I'll address a couple of issues that I see, what we're getting wrong as an ed tech community. It surprises me that even about 60, 70 years after medicine adopted evidence-based care, we don't have any such equivalent in education. We don't have any evidence-based learning, right? That's largely agreed to by the community, right? So I'll give you a little bit of an anecdote. About 3-4 years back, when we were first starting this whole Watson AI project for education, we wanted to experiment, and we were basically playing around with several AI technologies and trying to figure out which of these things would be engaging to students. And so I basically decided to go to my local school board. I live in Westchester. And asked them if they would be interested in piloting any of these technologies in the classroom. I actually went there expecting to be thrown out of the room, right? To my surprise, they said, "Oh yeah, we'd love this." They attached, a couple of science teachers. So we spent 6 months. We actually went into a classroom for a few weeks. We piloted the technology, and of course, we learned a lot. The students learned a lot, but when I look back on it and reflect on it, the experiment, there was actually no real policies behind, how we could go and do these experiments. People weren't necessarily worried about what an augmented reality experience will do to children, and so on, right? So that's one. A larger indictment of EdTech is that despite intelligent tutors or personalized learning systems having been around for a long time, we don't really have great evidence of efficacy, right? We don't have a lot of very clear-cut A/B studies that show that these systems really work. And the reason for that is, at least till just a few years back, we didn't have cloud, we didn't have access to large quantities of students, and we couldn't do very careful, statistically rigorous experiments with incontrovertible evidence for performance improvements, right? And you know, as a quick contrast, Facebook is doing all kinds of experiments on people and emotions and you know, how people react to various types of news feeds being pushed on them, and they're learning a lot about human psychology in the process. But they can do that because they have a billion people on the platform, and they can try all kinds of experiments. And no, I'm not going to address whether it's ethical or not. I certainly have a very strong opinion on that. We'll leave it there. But it's you actually require something of that nature to really get learning on a much more scientific basis. So that's what EdTech has done.
So I will offer one comment on that. I'm going to put out one more question. I'm going to put you all to work. I would also say that the difference there is, in many ways, the capacity in school systems to think that way or do that work is incredibly limited. Not because they don't want to. It's just simply a matter. I mean, so purchasing new software upgrades, things like that. When it's either doing that or buying a teacher, right? You go with a teacher. Right? And that's part of the challenge. So even to be able to do some of that is just the capacity doesn't exist. So I'm going to ask you guys one question, and then again I'm going to put the audience to work. So are there one promise of data, I think, and the amount of data we have is that we can create knowledge if analyzed properly, right? We can actually learn some things if we look at our data properly. Are there certain decisions in schools or in school systems that could be automated to a certain extent, or be at least move further along without human intervention? Are there kinds of decisions that we should be making based on the data that we have in school systems that we currently have humans making?
I'll jump in. I mean, this is stuff I work on my desk. Our menu of interventions is something that should just be algorithmically driven. I mean, we call it a system of student support in my school district, but it should just be a bunch of if-then statements. You have kids that, you know, have 2 absences in science, but then because the science or the biology teacher doesn't speak to the English teacher, the 2 absences in science and 2 absences in English don't trigger the 3 absence rule because there's no connectivity there. So then human beings are like literally meeting every week for hours, comparing like case notes and random spreadsheets or notebooks, paper notebooks. That's the technology problem. You know, whether it's a CRM system in the education space or another type of system that better brings together data on the person as a unit of interest.
So interventions, other ideas. What can be automated in school systems, if anything, through better use of data?
Scheduling is a huge issue, especially at the beginning of scheduling, especially at the beginning of the year. So if you look at school start and kids aren't on the roster, or they need to change, or there's a brother that's coming in, or a sister that's leaving, or what have you. So understanding that and providing the data for the people when they're speaking to the parents in the moment, and actually having an idea versus you walk into a cafeteria and there are hundreds of families waiting to get scheduled on the first day of school. So it won't be perfect, you still need intervention, but something like that is a pain point for the system and for the parent, right? And it sets the culture off.
When I was a superintendent, one of my favorite things to do was visit high school guidance suites in the first week of school, because you know right off the bat whether they're, you know, how well they study, right, and whether it's a school chaos or not. Anything else on this question, Kristen?
Sure. I think teachers are one of our most treasured resources in the space and in schools, and they spend a significant amount of time grading papers and scoring various things, as opposed to actually spending that time to intervene with students or to do other lessons. And the more and more we can automate that, not just in multiple choice ways, but in rich, meaningful ways that can interpret writing and projects and other things like that, so that teachers can be doing some of the most important part, which is teaching. I think that's a huge opportunity for technology.
So again, go to a middle or high school during finals week and you see the line of people who are waiting to scan their bubble sheets, right? Yeah, it's a huge challenge. Okay, so we're going to come back to the panel, but I also want to talk to each other. But I want you guys to talk to each other. Right? Come up with a question that you all can agree on that you want to ask this panel of folks about the use of data in school systems.
Yes.
Which means you shouldn't be looking at your devices. You should be talking to each other.
Benjamin, I come from Paris. C'est vrai.
I'm Czech. Czech.
Good.
But you probably don't.
No, but I have been to Prague.
I lived there for 8 months now.
For what?
8 months.
8 months. But you,
I moved back here in
okay, so you were fresh in New York. So you were born and raised in
No, all my family is. My family is all there, but I was born in New York.
so you're American.
I'm American. So, what is it about why are you here?
I'm here because my company is doing adaptive learning. So adaptive learning, it's work like a kind of GPS for education. So you get data from the students, and you can be position place for each piece of knowledge and skills. You know for the student where he is on the map of knowledge and skills. So you manage that, this is topic, and so on. So it's like a map, very precise, and you know how then to go from a level A to a level B, knowing what precisely the student knows. So you can create a personalized path,
Like another minute?
way which is 100% logical. So it helps the student to be more efficient, and it reveals also what you know. So you forget the grade and you see it's past. It's just show you where you are, and there's no judgment.
So,
grades or ABC grades will still be around in 1820.
what questions
Very good question.
agreed on want to ask?
I will ask you.
Okay.
Panel. And Newman right here has a microphone.
Yes, your English is better than mine.
Who wants to go first? Right back there.
Are you at a distance? Your French is much better than
So, and if I get this question wrong from our group,
So that's okay.
I'm sure they'll help me out. But
Videograph.
but it was a bit of, where do you think the policy needs to be, and how do we teach the boards of these schools in order to create the right policy for our administrators to learn about big data and AI and IT, such that we have this coming from the top down, as well as what we're seeing today coming from students to teachers and coming out from the bottom up.
All right, so what should the right policy environment be, right, at the systems level to support the use of big data? Who wants to? John, you're a leader professor, right? So that should be up your alley. It is now.
Throwing it down my alley. We'll see if I throw a striker or gutter ball here. So school boards, I think, need to lead by doing. And so, I'm not particularly aware of the extent to which school boards use data to inform their decision making. My guess is not very much. And so I think that would be a great place and a great potential market for developers to think about how to reorient either existing data or present data particularly for the policy decisions of school boards. I'm not aware of that, but I think that would be a fantastic place to look. And maybe folks who are in districts could talk about that.
Anybody else want to take it on?
Josh, when you were superintendent.
Well, I know, but I'm moderating. I'm not. I try to keep my opinion to myself.
So one of the things that, and I think this is true whether it's a board or any governing body, there is both beauty and fear in transparency of data, right? And so the beauty is that you can measure what you can manage, and I think boards want that, right? They want to be able to manage, they want to be able to measure how it's going. But the fear is that if you sat there for several years or decades and you said it's fine, and then the data shows that it isn't, or the data shows that your resources are in the wrong spot, or that there's a problem that you're unaware of that goes beyond the socioeconomic background that they look at, right? Because so many kids have freedom to use lunch, etc. Then there's a fear, right? Because now that data is public, and what do you do about it, and how do you address that? Because we know there are no silver bullets and no overnight changes. So I think that as we think about data beyond just the building or beyond the district, it's also how do you present that data and how do you actually have action plans so that the data is actionable and people feel as if they can take ownership and help get the right results. And celebrate when there are right results, right? So when you have great results, you celebrate, and if there's something that's not quite showing up or something that maybe a union wouldn't want to see as it relates to adults in the building and how they're used or not used or what their scores are or not, then how do you help have an action plan that's fair?
But Maya, that happens all up and down the system, right? So you have that same fear of a teacher who might reveal things by sharing their data with their superiors. So how have we managed that in other areas of the system that we can learn from in order to apply it to the board level?
Absolutely, that exists now, but the level of granularity that if we capture the data correctly now, the level of granularity it's harder for folks to hide. And so I do agree that we need to see where are we capturing it well. So we captured data on students falling behind and we put in an intervention program in, or other examples like that, right? But I just think we need to be cognizant that data is its own kind of tricky.
Chris wants to get in, and I am.
I think the point of leading by example for boards is really important. But I think one of the things that happens lower down in the system that we start seeing is that there's not just the analysis that's happening, but there are actually resources. There are people whose job it is to not only analyze that, but to then start taking some action based on what they find. And oftentimes boards say,
we're not doing it to the teachers, but teachers are alongside of the students as they're learning. I don't think that AI replaces the adults in the classroom, to your point. It should augment human capabilities. And so that's very promising in today's world. Some of the work that we're doing actually, one of the firms I work with Watson is around how do you actually feed Watson information around math, which is much easier to teach from an AI perspective than English or some of the other topics. It's pretty, at early levels, it's pretty straightforward at elementary what the rules are. And so again, that task-oriented, you can think about where that might be able to be talk through some of the thinking around that, but that's exciting as well because that takes it beyond where it is today.
And Chris, you guys have figured that out. Tell me, your work is much more mathematics than theirs, because it's a little more straightforward. Anybody else want to get in on this?
Just really quick. Again, my day job, I get pitched from literally everyone in the industry. And the thing that I actually think is really ready to pop and the technology is there is simple. It's computer adaptive testing, supervised machine learning. Assessment engines are going to get bigger and bigger, so if you're building a product, you can an assessment engine and find some content. And when you look at some of the real standout products in the industry, I'm not going to plug them, but there's you can just Google and find two really big ones that are cool. You'll see that they're getting better at understanding the many relationships between the different content standards. So when I talked about that linearity of learning earlier, some companies, some of the standouts are actually figuring that out. using machine learning. So that's a really, really awesome place to be that doesn't scare people, because augmented reality literally scared my last superintendent, scared the bejesus out of me. We demanded I restrict access to all augmented reality products.
Yeah, I think when it comes to what's actually happening for students in the classroom, people get scared at the idea that there's a computer saying what should happen, whether it's augmented reality or whether or not it's just putting a student in front of a machine and it's deciding what happens next. I think one of the safer ways in has been when boards, when district leaders, when principals and teachers are looking for broader patterns, and they start asking questions, and they say, like, show me the students that struggled 3 days in a row. Show me the students that were this. Show me the students that were that. Show me, can I teach adding fractions before I teach subtracting fractions? Like those types of things. How are kids doing? And as you start asking those types of questions, whether or not you're typing it in or doing it through a voice interface, you eventually get to this space where you start trusting the answers. Just like we sort of trust what we ask people a lot of times now. And when you do that, you then eventually start saying, what should I do for this kid? What should I do for that kid? Can I put this in front? And you have to build that trust. I think trying to take that leap really requires the true cutting edge folks, because as you were describing about other industries or what Facebook is doing, trying to run experiments, no one wants to run experiments or feels comfortable running experiments on their kids. Where should we run those experiments? So we have to find a different entry point that feels safe to build that trust in AI or machine learning to then get to that point.
So as I've been listening to you all talk about this, it keeps coming back in my mind. This question I keep coming back to, which is that it sounds like people can interpret your comments as though you want to create teacher-proof environments, right? Where machines are doing the work there, whether it's augmented reality, whether it's adaptive assessments, but that machines are making decisions and machine intervention, which is something that teachers typically do. And I know none of you are recommending that, but I can see how that can be interpreted. So talk a little bit about the role of the teacher, the role of the paraprofessional, the role of the building principal, guys, with all this. You did all this right. How do those roles change? John, start with you.
So, I actually think that this is going to create more demand for more educated and more sophisticated teachers. And so, if you think about the idea of using assessment to facilitate learning, then you have a learner's current position. You use an assessment to figure out where they are relative to some goal. There's a gap between their current performance and their goal, and that information needs to be used to give feedback to the instructor to make a response to get students closer to the goal. That's a very human enterprise. So what we're talking about is not replacing. I think what we're talking about is giving information to somebody so that they can make use of it in an instructional response. And so I think this is going to ratchet up the demand for more sophisticated consumers of data who can both get better information and give more sophisticated responses.
Yeah, but who's going to teach them how to do it? A whole separate conversation.
Yeah, that's a PD question.
Yeah, I know, but it's a big one.
Yeah.
Other thoughts on that? I'm going to turn it back over to the audience.
Yeah, so just, I think I agree with John. I think, and also with Chris, I think the recommender systems are systems that mine patterns and get insights are low-hanging fruit, right? They are here already, they've been here for a while. And deploying them and getting real insights for teachers is one of the best things AI can do immediately, right? So a way to look at it is these are systems that are complementing or in fact making teachers much more effective. And I love the point about we'll trust these systems in time if the insights make sense. There is still the larger issue of this whole black box. I mean, why should I trust the algorithm? Right? I don't understand why it gave me this recommendation. I don't understand what this insight is. Should I trust it? And that's something we have to solve for. And finally, in terms of the teacher PD, I completely agree. This is definitely going to require a slightly more sophisticated user. But even there, I think just simple engineering principles, software engineering principles about how we present information and insights can go a really long way towards making the technology seem seamless. The iPhone is a classic example. I'm sure your mom uses it, and it's a highly sophisticated technology, but it's so easy for people to use. So this is where, when I say we need to be more imaginative as a bunch of technologists, that's basically the kind of thing I'm alluding to.
So the black box is so important. When I was an accountability guy, I always used to, and as superintendent as well, always used to tell the folks in the state what it was, that the bigger the black box, the less credibility you have with this. And that's what I get concerned about. So any other folks want to comment on the role of the teacher, role of the principal, and then we'll turn back over to the audience. We have a couple minutes left. All right, audience, questions out there?
Yeah, we have a question back here.
Hi, it's not so much a question as it is a comment. I'm Janice Gobert from Rutgers University. Also have a startup called Apprentice. We're doing real-time data analytics, personalized learning using supervised machine learning, as you talked about. And I think the real opportunity that we have as a community right now is marrying the computational science with the learning sciences that's driving the supervised machine learning. That's going to move us from 50%, 60%, 80% predictive validity to 95%, which is what we have in my system, okay? So when you marry the computational analytics with deep learning sciences theory, that's how you refine your categories. And therefore you can get really tight personalization, teacher learning platforms, etc. So I really think that what the opportunity is in companies coming together with schools of ed, forums like this that drive the conversation forward, and then the partnerships with schools, which we see here, which is really nice. So that's just the comment I want to make.
Yeah, and I would, so I think it's an important comment. I would also just ask well, maybe I'll make a statement. The relationship between pedagogy currently and learning science is pretty, it's non-existent in lots of ways, and now, so you sort of wonder, how can some of these technologies actually help bridge the gap that currently exists, because we don't have learning science-based pedagogy in our many schools now. Anyone comment on the comment? All right, where's the next microphone?
Actually, I'll make a comment on that. I think it's a great point. I think the two are separate to some degree, but they both use data. Learning sciences are paying attention to the data that's happening. We do need to figure out how we marry those groups. And the only comment I really want to make there is, why is there that divide to some degree? And I think there has to be an openness to some degree to rethinking some of the things that we know. There are lots of folks who have been teaching for 10 years, 25 years, who are like, this is the right order in which these things should happen. There are, sometimes in mathematics it's called the math wars, about all the different sort of almost religious dogma that goes to what should work and what shouldn't work. And sometimes the data is seen as questioning that, pushing back. And we need to figure out how it's not discrediting a number of people so that they are open to that feedback and that information. And I think organizations partnering and pairing in these ways is one way in, but I see that as one of the bigger blockers.
Okay, a few minutes left, right? There's a question right there.
So we had a question at our table about data interoperability. Right? The challenges that exist when you have 200 software platforms, each collecting their own data, they're not talking to each other. In the personal tech world, we use things like if this then that, right? Trying to connect things. We have APIs where we're trying to pull data in one place to another. I haven't seen much work. Most companies seem to want to have a silo of information and ownership of it. I'm particularly interested in opening up to collaborating with other pieces of software. So a question about the potential for that to happen in the future and how that might accelerate learning and usefulness in a school district. And then at a second level is, given that we have a principle of local control in our school systems, right? If we have trouble getting, say, the English teacher and the science teacher's attendance to connect to each other, right? How might we expect the data to transfer when a student moves from one district to another, right? How is that even going to follow a kid? Is that a pipe dream that we might ever get a common core of data, right? We can follow a kid from one district to another to address what we know is a high mobility, especially among high needs students.
Not if we call it Common Core. Anybody want to address the interoperability issue?
I mean, that's literally a huge problem in education.
It's not around anymore. That's a whole other diatribe or story to tell. But at the end of the day, it's usually the policy and privacy space that ends up taking that down. There's another attempt at it happening right now. It's called Project Unicorn because it's such a dream. But if you want to learn about it, because I know we don't have a ton of time, look up Project Unicorn, which is trying to follow in the footsteps of
I just want to also just share a dirty reality of the way many school systems work, right? Because most school districts are small. There's one data person that's been around forever. They may have been a guidance counselor who was scheduling, then they go to the central office and the data. The transactional database has been around since 1973. There's a symbiotic relationship between the vendor and that person, right? And so they customize, and then a new superintendent comes in, and then the superintendent leaves, then right? And there's no incentive to change those databases. There's no there's few resources also. So there's a deep structural issue that I actually think should be taken up by states. It's a separate issue. I think states should run on that because you get much more economy of scale. But the way the decisions get made in school districts around this stuff is at such a low level mostly. It's very hard to move. We have time for one more question. Make it a good one. No pressure.
So, isn't teachers baiting away from using data because they don't have time to actually adapt the teaching? Even though we give them tools or give them recommendations, do they actually have the time, considering how curriculum is made and how the system works, to actually adapt something?
Sort of so what question?
Oh,
Know it, and then what do you do? Right? You have the time or the knowledge to actually do something. John.
So, I think that this is the knife edge of the life of a teacher, right? Because on one side, you have to progress, you have to move forward, you have to cover some level of content. But on the other side, you don't want to sacrifice understanding, right? Because that just digs the hole deeper and deeper for students who have shallow understanding who are matriculating forward. But this is the pressure of the life of a teacher, and virtually, when I interview teachers, and I do hundreds of teachers a year, this is a key thing. But I think this is never going to go away, and so we have to find a way to dance along that edge.
And we also shouldn't think about it in terms of individual teachers as much as school communities and how they construct time to interact with data. Our time's up. Corey Newman, I want to thank you all for attending. I want to thank our panel for your insightful, intelligent, thoughtful commentary. Thank you all for attending. We'll see you at the reception. Thanks everybody for